So let's discuss fractions and what fractions, I guess, visually represent, and also the mathematical notation of them. Essentially, fractions are commonly used to represent parts of a whole. It can be parts of a whole in terms of greater than one as well, but we're just going to focus on parts of just one whole as itself. Essentially, we can visualize a fraction by looking at how much of an object that we shade, whether it be a rectangular object such as what I've got here or other types of objects. So if I was to shade just half of this rectangle here, so let's approximate roughly where half is. What I've essentially done is I've broken up this rectangle into two even portions, even halves. And we say that this fraction is half of this rectangle. It's 1 out of 2 portions of this rectangle. If I was to divide it into fourths, like this, into 4 pieces, and to shade just a quarter of it, all right, we say this is 1/4 of it, shaded, essentially. I can shade more than 1/4 of it. I could sit here and divide it into fourths, for example, and shade 3/4 of it. And we refer to this as 3/4 shaded. Now, we can refer to these in different ways as well. We could sit there and take a circle, for example, and shade half a circle in. And it's going to be the same sort of visual representation. But essentially what we're looking at here is breaking a whole, the whole of the object being whatever object that we're dealing with, and then shading in however much of, like breaking into smaller segments and shading in however much of it that we have, essentially. Now, in terms of a number line, we can think of it as a number line between, say, 0 and 1. 1 being our whole, 0 being nothing of it. And halfway between, if we were to divide it into 2 equal segments, we could find that value of a half. Similarly, if we were to further divide this up into more segments, such as fourths, we could find where 1/4 would be and 3/4 would be, or 3/4. So essentially, it's just a way to represent a part of a whole. Okay, and that whole can exist between 0 and 1, but it can exist between other numbers as well. Another way to visually represent this is to look at something like a fraction wall, such as this. Where you can see down the bottom here, I've got one whole segment. So we're looking at sort of rows here, and I'm sort of looking at this row just in here. And this is one whole. It's 1 out of 1, essentially. We've broken our object into one piece out of our whole object. If I look at the second line, we've broken into 2 segments, all right? And each one of these segments is 1 of 2 segments, essentially 2 equal portions, or a half. In the next one, we've broken into 3 sections, and each of them are going to be thirds. You can see it just continues. We've got fourths, then fifths, and essentially we're just breaking it up into equal segments. So if we sort of fill it out and think of it in this way, we can represent that same whole number into smaller sections. Okay, and we've got them sort of represented all the way up to here. And the reason why it's useful to think about it in this way is we can think sometimes we actually have equivalences, and we'll have its own section on equivalent fractions, but you can sort of sit here and go, we could have this half just in here and look at other areas that also represent a half. So if we look at that, if we join 2 quarters together, it represents the same sort of area. We could represent 3/6 together, and that'll represent the same sort of space. We do the same with 8ths, the same with 10ths, and the same with 12ths. Oops, I just went a little bit too far. But this kind of illustrates, it kind of is like a visual illustration that we can have equivalences, but we can break up an object into smaller chunks to describe those equivalences of each other. Okay, so essentially fractions are parts of wholes, and the way to think about how fractions sort of come about is we divide that whole into smaller fragments. Okay, those fragments can be as many of them as we want. We can go well beyond just having twelfths. We can have hundredths, thousandths, so on and so forth. But that's what fractions are.